What's good? It's me, your boy Squiddy, back again with another video. And today I wanted to do a video on the Ishizu cards that we all know are coming out in the Magnificent Mavens pack. That's just before YCS Pasadena, so it's going to be legal for that. So know there are a bunch of regionals and stuff happening. And yeah, these cards are just so insane. It basically pushes Tearlaments to tier 0 in OCG at the time that these were all at 3 because they were just so degenerate. Yeah, I want to make a quick video to kind of go through these just so you guys are kind of familiar with them and how they actually make it so tiers are so broken. Essentially, these are a series of cards that are modeled off of the older cards that the anime character Ishizu Ishtar used in the anime. So, we have Agido, Kelbeck, Keldo, and Medora, which happen to be these old cards that were just super, super janky, but now they've been remodeled and recrafted into super crazy cards with a bunch of different effects. I guess to start off, we want to talk about these two traps. So the ones that have obelisks on them, these two are terrible. So, Last Tell by Fate, I haven't read the full effect, but I read basically you just have to read the first sentence of each card and you can tell that they're terrible. This card is like when an opponent's monster declares an attack, so already you know you don't want to play this. And then this one says if you control 3 or more Earth Fairy monsters, which never really happens. So these two, any ones that have obelisks, you can just completely disregard. The ones that we care about are the other 6, well, mainly the 4 monsters. So these ones are all staples. Gravekeeper's Trap, you can also kind of play it. I've seen the OCG players kind of flip-flop, and then there's also Exchange of the Spirit, which these are all modeled off of. Essentially, having Exchange of the Spirit in your graveyard allows these cards to be even stronger. They have different effects that are kind of boosted by having that in your graveyard. So yeah, starting off with the Agido, the Ancient Century. These are all level 4 Earth Fairies, by the way. It's kind of like how they're designed. The effect is if a card is sent from the hand and or deck to your opponent's graveyard, except during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your hand. Then you can special summon 1 level 4 Earth Fairy monster from your graveyard. So essentially, these monsters all have 3 effects. They have the main effect, so this one summons from hand, some of them mill, and then the other ones, actually they all summon from hand in some capacity, but they're different activation requirements. So the rest of the effect is, if this card is sent from the hand or deck to the graveyard, you can send the top 5 cards of each player's deck to the graveyard, which is super insane because you're milling 5. Then if Exchange of the Spirit is in your graveyard, you can send the top 5 cards of either player's deck to the graveyard. So essentially, you are able to mill 5 cards whenever this card is milled from the deck to the graveyard or sent from the hand to the graveyard. And then if you have Exchange of the Spirit in your graveyard, you can mill another 5 if you choose to. And then obviously it's a hard once per turn. All these cards are. Yeah, this one's super, super good. Obviously, it allows you to mill 5 cards. Same thing with the Kelbeck. It's another one that mills. This card is also has a hand effect. If a card is sent from the hand or deck to the opponent's graveyard, except during the damage step, you can target one opponent's special summoned monster, special summon this card from your hand, then return the targeted monster to the hand. And then the other effect is if this card is sent from hand or deck to the graveyard, you can send the top 5 cards of each player's deck to the graveyard. So again, same effect as Agido in that these two mill 5 cards. And then if Exchange of Spirits in your graveyard, you can set 1 trap from your graveyard, which is super, super busted. So you can kind of see how having Exchange of the Spirit in your graveyard allows you to do some cool things. This is obviously a cool little hand trap that you can respond when you either mill your opponent, by using either of these effects, or when your opponent happens to mill themselves, or even use a hand trap, because that does count as sending a card from their hand to the graveyard. You can target one of their special summon monsters, special summon this, and then bounce that monster to the extra deck or the hand. So yeah, super, super neat. These two are the mill cards. And then we have these two. So Keldo, the Possessed Statue, you can discard one other Earth Fairy monster, so any of these. Special summon this card from your hand, then add 1 Exchange of the Spirit, or any card that mentions it from your deck to your hand. So you can search all of these cards because they all happen to mention Exchange of the Spirit. And then the other effect is Quick Effect. You can banish this card from your field or graveyard, target up to 5 cards in any graveyard, shuffle them into the deck. If Exchange of Spirit is not on your field or in your graveyard at activation, you can only target up to 3 cards. So this card is super, super insane. Number 1, first and foremost, in your hand, if you happen to just draw 2 or more of these, you can discard one to special summon this as a level 4 extender. And then the other effect in the graveyard, obviously, is you can banish it to shuffle back 3 cards, any 3 cards, or 5 if you have Exchange of the Spirit, which is super, super crazy. Just imagine like milling this, using these cards, you're milling like 5-10 cards, milling this with a bunch of tier names. This essentially shuts off the graveyard for your entire opponent. And also you're able to recycle your own resources because it is a quick effect. You can shuffle back any 3 cards. And then Medora is you can discard one other Earth Fairy monster, special summon this card from your hand. So same thing as Keldo. And then you can place one Gravekeeper's Trap from your deck to your spell or trapped zone. So this is a card that you would place using this card's effect. And then the other effect is the same as Keldo in that you can banish up to 3 cards or 5 if you have Exchange of Spirit. So these 2 cards are essentially in the Tearlaments mirror. These cards are the powerful ones. It's not really the milling ones, but these ones are powerful because the entire mirror kind of revolves around having access to these cards so that you can shut your opponent off from using the tier effects. Because obviously when you shuffle them back every resolution, if they're not able to use themselves as fusion material, then they don't fuse. So yeah, these monsters are super, super, super powerful. And then there's, of course, Gravekeeper's Trap. While Exchange of the Spirit is in your graveyard, your opponent cannot activate card effects in the graveyard or special summon monsters from the graveyard. So already it's like a Necro Valley. Insane in the tier mirror, obviously, because they cannot activate any card effects in the graveyard, including the tier limit names, as well as any of the Ishizu cards that they happen to have. But you have to have Exchange of the Spirit in your graveyard, which is a lot easier said than done, because it is somewhat of a brick. And then the other effect is you can only use each of these once per turn, hard once per turn. During the main phase, you can discard 1 card, add 1 Gravekeeper's monster, or 1 Earth Fairy monster from your deck to hand. So you can add any of these by discarding a card from your hand as a cost, including any of these. So for example, if you discard a Guido or a Kelbeck, you can also mill 5 because they are sent from the hand to the grave. Or if you discard any of these, you can use their effects. Since this is a cost, it's really neat. When you discard these, you can immediately fire these off. So, for example, if you happen to have this and then you have one of these guys in your hand, your opponent might think you don't have any of these, so they go ahead and activate a tier name. You can fire this off, discard one of these for cost, and then before this resolves on the same chain link, you can just banish one of these from your graveyard to stop that tier effect. So it's kind of neat in that it's an interrupt. And then when you do discard, you add 1 Earth Fairy monster. So you can add either of these to also trigger them. For example, if you happen to do this in response to your opponent milling themselves and discard something to add Kelbeck. After the chain resolves, you can actually activate Kelbeck to target a monster your opponent controls that's special summoned and then bounce that because it's kind of like Altergeist, the multi-faker, in that when you use that 1 trap to shuffle it back, Altergeist Protocol, you can summon it back on the new chain because it is an if effect. So it's kind of neat. You can kind of play around. Same thing with Agido. If your opponent mills themselves, you can actually add this and then special summon back one of these. So for example, on your turn, you might be able to use this as a level 4 extender. So super, super neat. And then the other effect is during your opponent's draw phase, before they draw, if this card is already face up on the field, declare 1 card name, look at the card your opponent would draw for the normal draw, and if it is the declared card, send it to the graveyard. This is actually a super, super unique effect. It's also mandatory, so one thing to note is that try not to forget this. I don't know what would happen in the game state. I think if you do forget, then it's just accepted at that point because they would already shuffle their hand. But try to do this before your opponent draws a card. You get to declare any card name. So for example, if you have a board, maybe you want to declare something like Evenly Matched or Dark Ruler No More, or anything that might stop you. And on the chance that you do hit it, obviously you go super plus. But if you don't, you still get some free perfect information in that you get to see what your opponent draws for turn, so you can play around that based on what you have. So this is a really, really neat card. Obviously, it is a trap, so it's kind of a brick. A lot of OCG players chose not to play it, but I still think it's really useful because anytime that you have Medora or even Keldo, sometimes you do want to search this because you do have like the ability to cycle through your names really fast, in that you could use this. If you have this on Medora, you can obviously use this on your turn because it does come up on the board face up. You can discard something to add, let's say Keldo or Medora, and then on their turn, you can discard whatever you added to add a Kelbeck. So you have a Banish 3 and you have a Kelbeck bounce. So it kind of like makes it so you have like access to all these guys and then also have interrupts. So yeah, super, super neat. Some things to note about the tier mirrors: you don't want to use these to mill your opponent if you don't have to. It's kind of like in Yu-Gi-Oh! And past formats, there have been a lot of things that you have to play around. So for example, in like the mirror matches with Necros, you didn't want to leave a monster on board because that means it could Trishula you. In the Shadal mirror match, you didn't want to leave a fusion monster on the board because that means they could resolve Shadal fusion by fusing from deck. Same kind of concept here in this mirror match. You don't want to mill your opponent if you don't have to, because that could severely backfire on you. For example, if they mill better than you, Even if you have access to these, try not to mill them if you don't have to, because it could just present them a chance to set up their board, and it kind of like gives your opponent a chance to win the game that could otherwise be heavily skewed in your favor because you did go first, for example. Definitely don't do this, especially if you're going in blind, you're going first, you don't know what deck your opponent's playing. Don't take the risk. The only time you should be using these effects in the mirror match is if you have to, if you absolutely have to. So, for example, if you're bricked and you're like, oh crap, I literally have to use these guys' effects, then by all means do what you have to. The other time is when you have a Abyss Dweller, and then you fire off the Abyss Dweller's effect during your turn, so you can actually use these effects, and your opponent graveyard is shut off, so you can actually benefit by milling Tearlaments or milling these cards. And then because they can't use any of their effects, you don't really care. After you mill, you can actually use these to fix your opponent's graveyard by banishing these from yours to shuffle back any Ishizus or anything you don't want in their grave. So it kind of gives you like the upper hand, so you can mill for free. One thing else to note about these cards is that they also work with cards like Herald of the Orange Light, being fairies, obviously, and this card discards another fairy from your hand as a cost. So if you discard either of these, you can actually, after destroying your opponent's monster, you can mill 5 if you choose to. So fun things to note. Between these two, I would think that Agido is definitely a lot worse, because even though you can mill 10, obviously, with Exchange of the Spirit, this card doesn't really do anything. Like, yeah, you can summon something back during your turn. You can make Asa. It's a free level 4 extender. You can make a free Dweller. It's kind of cool that you put bodies on board, but it doesn't really do anything during your opponent's turn, whereas Kelbeck can actually be useful. For example, if your opponent has a Kick Callus on their board and then they happen to use a Shiren effect or something else to mill, you can actually respond with this to bounce back the Kick Callus. So at the worst, this actually is like, it's not the best hand trap in the world, but it does, because it's like kind of restrictive in that your opponent has to send a card from their deck or hand to the grave, but it does do something, and then it also gives you a body on board on top of that. So super neat to note. And obviously all of these being level 4 is super crucial, in that you can make it a Abyss Dweller a lot easier. You can make things like Baguska. You can make a lot of rank 4s using these as bodies. So yeah, that's about it for the intro. If you guys have any questions, leave a note below. I'm going to do more videos on deck recipe and also some combos on the deck.